let's look at the impact. Let's look at Bolshevik ideology. So at the base, let's look at it at a base. Let's look at it at an absolute base. At the base, communism is the brainchild of Karl Marx and Friedrich. Sorry, I don't even know how to say his name. And according to Nessler, communism is a theory or system of social organization promoting shared ownership of property and the means of production by the community as a whole or the state. Now, more important than that, I feel like, is just knowing the key features. And I feel like as soon as I felt more confident with the key features, it was easier to understand and apply the ideology a bit more. So there's the ideal of a classless society, promotion of equality, abolition of private property, not personal property. There was central planning for the big government, which involved redistribution of land, wealth, income, and resources. There was historical progress. They were far left on the political spectrum, and communism isn't homogeneous, so there's no one who hates communists more than other communists with slightly different interpretations of communism, which we're going to look at next, because there's so many different types and interpretations of communism, and we're about to look at that now. But I think that understanding the key features of the ideology is really important, because then you can directly connect those straight towards each dot point. I'm just bringing up, I typed up some notes that I wanted to talk about specifically for this point, because there's so much in Russia. I want to have some points up that I can specifically talk to you guys about that I just thought were the most important. So this is the history of the class struggle, and it's believed that throughout time it's moved up to getting to that point of communism, which is essentially classless. But like, is it really? Let's look at the variations of communist thought, and this is important because by kind of understanding the difference between orthodox Marxism, which is Menshevism, permanent revolution, and then socialism in one country, which was under Stalin, the power struggle, it all links to each other. Like, this is literally a big kind of foundation of the power struggle, even though it's a completely different point. So permanent revolution was the brainchild of Trotsky. It was adopted by Lenin as the official Bolshevik party policy, and it was this whole idea of international revolution where Russian socialism couldn't exist within a capitalist world or continent, and instead it literally had to spread across all the rest of the world. And then they believed that as Russia was the weakest link in the chain, they had to support other socialist revolutions around the world. So it was combined and uneven development. So the peasantry and the proletariat are at different levels of development, where peasantry was very much at feudalism and proletariat class was at capitalism. So for both of them to transition, the peasantry had to have like this fast forward through capitalism, with the socialist proletariat as future inspiration. So it's kind of, it was very much, I think with Trotsky, the main thing you have to understand is that he was very big on this like international revolution, while Lenin's was the socialism in one country. So he's just, everyone has surely seen this picture of Stalin. We actually had this photo of Stalin up in our classroom. Like, we asked our teacher to put this photo up of him, just for context. This is so socialism in one country was the brainchild of Joseph Stalin, and it became the official Bolshevik party policy during the power struggle, especially when he won. So it was focused that right now Russia should focus on the development of socialism internally, and that would require adopting a policy of isolationism and increasing economic self-sufficiency. And when you look at that, this is why I mean that understanding the ideology is important, because it'll link to other points in the syllabus. The ideology and this idea of increasing economic self-sufficiency is important, because that literally links to the economic transformation. And that's why even if you're writing about the economic transformation, you can like one up your markers and like get some brownie points by linking back to ideology, which is always going to get your marks. I feel like ideology is very much ignored in modern history because it is difficult to understand, and there's like a lot of facets and aspects to it. But that's by linking back to it and by showing good knowledge of that, we're getting brownie points. We're standing out in the marking center. and it responded to many of the concerns post-war Russian citizens had with permanent revolution. So that idea was that like international revolution would require more conflict was like a big nope. While socialism in one country preyed on growing sense of nationalism and it portrayed Russia as capable and strong enough to do it on its own. But these ideological differences were key to the power struggle and were also key to his consolidation of power and why Stalin was doing the things that he was doing and why he believed it. A lot of the successes that you can see in collectivization and of industrialization are a direct result on like the sense of nationalism and this whole idea of being able that to depict Russia as being capable and strong enough to do it on their own. He was very big on that idea of nationalism and just focusing on the internal, while Trotsky was much bigger on the international. Let's take this Mr. Worldwide. Let's look at theory and praxis, which I didn't learn about until very late into year 12, but I wish I learned about it more. Theory is the foundations of the ideology. So theory is like the Communist Manifesto. So it's like the actual foundation is kind of that concrete, while praxis is the practical application of the theoretical ideas. So that's putting that ideology and that theory into action. And you can say that with like the 1917 revolution. The communist theory failed to acknowledge the needs conditions of post-1917 Soviet society, which you can see through World War I, the lack of industrialization, uneven development, and the Civil War. So because of that, strict ideological adherence is often sacrificed or even temporarily withdrawn in order to better suit society's short-term needs, which is where you see the new economic policy, which is literally completely against the like the theory and the praxis, but it's going completely against it. So it actually represented a betrayal of the revolution and the Marxist communism theory, and it steered away from socialism and communism and was staying stagnant on capitalism. So how is that like how does that work? So that's why I think that understanding how some of that sometimes being so strictly adherent to the ideology has to be sacrificed for the short term in those emergencies, especially after war communism, because the Bolsheviks needed to save their reputation when so many people had starved under war communism in 1918. But yeah, that's just how I think having just a basic understanding of again where they were coming from on each side, and especially for the power struggle, understanding the differences in Trotsky and Stalin's ideology and how they approached this idea of communism is so important. And again, when you look at it, like a lot of the time it's easy to be like, oh, Bolshevik ideology is just communism, but when you're actually looking at them, both of them are looking at, well, Trotsky's looking at feudalism and capitalism. What's his name? Stalin's looking more at socialism. Like it's all, even though it's communism, this is why I think it's important to understand the ideology. It's very much pushed that like, oh, Russia's communist and like communist. But when you actually look at it in detail, they're actually trying to build up to that facet of communism through these three. So understanding that is really going to make a difference in your marks, and it's going to come across in all different in points in the social and political transformation, in the economic transformation, in the power struggle. It'll come up across different points. Okay, so for early and social political reforms, there were the land decrees, which was redistribution of land away from the aristocracy and towards the peasantry and proletariat. Guys, I'm really sorry. In line with communist theory, I've been talking for nearly 2 hours now. It's going. And then there's also the worker decrees, which was 8-hour working days, uninterrupted period of 36 hours rest, which was the weekend. And then they were on social insurance and restructuring the workplace hierarchies. So I think when you're looking at the 8-hour working days, that's very much where you can look, and what I was talking before about ethics, where you can look at the working conditions and how strict they were. Socially, that was negative, but economically, that led to such high levels of productivity, which benefited their economy. So economically, that's a good thing, but socially, it's a bad thing. And that's why I think having that like open-minded view where sometimes it has to come with the sacrifice, and that doesn't mean that it's right, but in the context of like modern history and what you're writing about, it's what you'd want to argue. And then there's the self-determination of Russian occupied nations, which was also in line with the communist theory. So Lenin believed that nationalism and the concept of like nationhood as a whole split the international proletariat, which made them easier for the bourgeoisies to control and envision a borderless world. So then Lenin was staunchly like anti-imperialism, and like most communists were. And then when you look at women's rights, they were very much in line with communist theory. So Lenin believed that women were an integral part of the revolution, and he actually made divorce easier to obtain, especially in the case of domestic violence, and he also legalized abortion. And then we've got this quote. Our demands are practical conclusions which we have drawn from burning needs, the shameful humiliation of women in bourgeoisie society, defenseless and without rights. And that very much links to this idea of communism and this classless society and the promotion of equality. So that very much links, and that's how you can see that women's rights, especially like at least under Lenin, were very much in line with communist theories. Now, when you're looking at other social and political reforms, censorship was also in line with communist theories. So the decree on the press gave the Soviet government the ability to shut down the papers, which was advocating opposition. Then the secret police, kind of in line with the communist theories. So thousands, including members of the proletariat, were persecuted, tortured, and killed by the Cheka, accused of such crimes as being Tsars, counter-revolutionaries, kulaks, and black marketeers. And then the social and political reforms overall were in line with the communist theory. So if you were to get a question on that, that's usually the judgments that's being made. But it's because it was the pragmatic thing for the Bolsheviks to do. They'd promised socialist reform before they came to power, and they had made pretty good of those promises. So we've got these quotes from A.J.P. Taylor. They needed to prove they were more capable than the provisional government, who had no popular mandate and little popular support. So at this stage, socialism was quite popular, and the majority of the reforms positively impacted masses. So we've got this quote from Sunny. They placed at the head of a genuinely popular movement, and the flimsy fabric of Bolshevik power rested entirely on popular support of key sectors of the population. And when you're going across it, you've got popular support from women, popular support from workers, and on self-determination as well. So it's just all working. Now, when we're looking at the treaty, which I feel like really came up in the essay question, so I hope you guys, even, I know I put exemplars, but I was trying to think ahead with the exemplars that I was putting in. So like I said, you guys can download the slides, but if you wanted to use some of the points, I put in exemplars from a lot from Russia, so you guys can literally take statistics and take quotes and take points. I had quite some work on the treaty as well. And this is all got to do with how much in line it was with the permanent revolution. Again, you can download all these notes. So if you wanted to download these slides and just add some of these points to your own notes or use them to start writing your notes, I definitely recommend. Trotsky had this idea of like neither peace nor war, which was very much in line with the idea of permanent revolution. It relied on an impending German revolution, which was to hold off signing the treaty. He thought that signing the treaty would stabilize Germany, and the conditions weren't as conducive with the socialist revolution. And instead, he initially accepted, because he was the Commissar of Foreign Affairs, but then that failed when the Germans invaded Russia during the armistice. So it didn't really help. Then Lenin had this whole idea of yield space, gain time, which also relied on impending German revolution, but he had a different conclusion that, if we sign the treaty, we'll just deal with the concessions for a while, but then everything will get back as soon as a socialist government in Germany grew. But no matter what, they were out of World War I, which was like the most pressing concern. And then they eventually accepted it after the German invasion, and that led to Lenin actually threatening to resign. And then Bukharin had this idea of revolutionary war, which was also in line with the permanent revolution, which was stay in the war and try to transform it into an imperialist war, to a class war, where you're like radicalizing the soldiers from Germany, Britain, and France, and banding them together to turn on army generals and officials, and then eventually on the bourgeoisie state. When you're looking across these three, and we're going to go through the other perspectives as well, I think you can see why Lenin was so popular, and Lenin was really loved in Russia, and that's why Stalin had such an obsession with like literally being all up on Lenin and trying to like act like his best friend, literally editing photos and like editing out what Lenin truly believes about him. But Lenin, for a lot of Russian people, their big thing was we just want to get out of World War One. Like we were really suffering. It's absolute rock bottom. Please get us out. And you can see that Lenin, his like most pressing concern was let's just get out of World War One. So his was very pragmatic. So even though it was in line with the permanent revolution, it was very pragmatic to just get them out. And I think that really proves why he had such popular support. Now, when you're looking at Trotsky, and his idea of the civil war, it was very much in line with communist ideology. So Trotsky toured the battle lines by train and equipped it with his own printing press. One thing that you can really recognize, even in the power struggle across Trotsky and Stalin, is that Trotsky was very much on the battle line. Like he was on trains, he was going around, he was with the soldiers because of his role. Stalin spent a lot more time with the people and a lot more time in the government. And I think spending that time with the people really helped him build that image of who he was, while Trotsky was always like away, never to be seen, not really like a people's man. And that very much led to the result of the power struggle as well. He capitalized on revolutionary fever and uniting influence on communism to encourage support for the Red Army over the capitalist or imperialist whites. And then we've got a quote here. I wanted to just add in some historian quotes because I know that they're hard to find sometimes. So I thought if any of you guys are downloading slides, you can just take them. They're specific ones. So that led to the appointment of 50,000 ex-Tsarist officers, which broke ideology, but it was pragmatic, because many Bolsheviks were like, oh, we're literally working with the enemy, and they disapproved of it. But that meant that there was military expertise to the Red Army, and the Red Army was really lacking at that point. So it was actually quite a smart thing to do. And then there was also the reinstating rank and class in the Red Army, which again breaks the ideology, but it was pragmatic. So I hope you can see with this point, and that's why I really wanted to bring them up, that ideology, it wasn't even like there was this super strict at all times was ideology being applied. A lot of the times it was, but at times, because they had to be pragmatic and because there were these emergencies, they had to break it and they had to like prioritize being pragmatic. So I wanted to just bring that up in ideology because I feel like, I don't know, even when I was doing modern, I very much was like, okay, Russia was communist. Everything they had to do had to align with communism. But there's a lot of contradictions to that. And as you're going throughout the syllabus and what you're seeing with like the consolidation and development of power. So I wanted to bring that up just so you guys can notice that difference. And I think that's an important part of ideology. So that was bringing back the different ranks and classes in the army. But again, when you look at communism, there's that whole idea of like a classless, like utopia, and there's like no class. So how are you going to bring classes into the army? Like, how does that work? So that shows that the ideology was broken, but pragmatically that was necessary for organizational purposes, because it was nearly impossible to coordinate the Red Army with with the numbers that there were without that. So you can see how they had to be pragmatic. That meant breaking the ideology, but it's kind of necessary. And then when you look at war communism, it's Russia's extreme form of total war was the mixiest of mixed bags. We've got this quote. They underwent a process of widespread nationalization and the process of transforming private assets into public assets. And it had a reversal of many early social and political reforms, such as workers' reforms, but it wasn't in line with the communist theory at all, because the proletariat experienced grueling long working days in awful conditions. I just have some quick notes that I wanted to tell you guys here. During war communism, which was introduced in 1918, over 70% of Russia's industrial capacity was geared to war. So adjusting production led to many difficulties for factories, and that led to large factory closures and redundancies. Workers were leaving city to return. The urban workforce decreased from 3.6 million to 1.4 million between 1912 and 1919. Urban people starved because of the harvest, and there was increased price of grain. It just wasn't a good time. It wasn't a good time, and they were so desperate to save their reputation, the Bolsheviks, that the new economic policy was kind of like the only thing that they could have done. This is where they reintroduced capitalist elements into the economy. So again, it's completely going against ideology, but they were so desperate that they kind of had to betray the revolution and communist theory. This is where grain requisitioning was abolished, the worker hour was shortened, trade unions were given limited but some freedom to operate, peasants were given the ability to trade, make a profit. Russia didn't become a capitalist country because the commanding heights of the economy was still in the hands of the state, but they were still very much along those lines of capitalism. But it was extremely controversial within the party because some members saw it as pragmatic and temporary retreat from socialism as a betrayal. So they really saw it as a betrayal. And here we've got this quote from a Bolshevik member: the NEP restored some prosperity to Russia, but to many of us, this prosperity was distasteful. And that's because it was a betrayal against the little foundation of the communist theory. So I don't want to go too in onto that, but I thought that to look at, I really wanted to focus especially on the skills for short answers and essays, because those are game changers. Those are going to affect like 100% of your exam. While Russia, not all of you guys are doing it. If you guys are saying it's here, I think that this point of ideology, like ideology is very quickly taught in the early dot points and like very high up, but then it's hard to make the links after. And I don't know, I just got a bit confused with Russia because, like I said, I thought like, oh, it's all communism, and then it's going capitalist, but then it's going back to socialism, but then it's like, oh, we got to bring the peasants from feudalism. Like, it's like moving everything around, and it was dealing with so many different classes. So I wanted to really, really specify this point. Lenin argued it was a one step backwards, two steps forward solution. So for Lenin, the Bolsheviks had to show the peasants that they could and would quickly change their policies to alleviate their want. It was very pragmatic, so it allowed the Bolsheviks to regain some of the proletariat trust after the Civil War and reinvigorate their economy that was on the verge of collapse because of war communism. Great job, guys. Russia wasn't in the condition to introduce socialism because it was limited. It had like a limited industry and a weak deficit economy. So they needed to reach this stage first before they could implement the ideology effectively. So they couldn't actually, unless they did the NEP and unless they brought in that sense of capitalism, they weren't actually going to get to socialism and then eventually to that communist utopia without it. So even though it wasn't in line with communist ideology, it was that step forward towards it. And that's why Lenin argued that it was one step backwards, but it was also two steps forwards towards it. Now, when we're looking at the power struggle, which I really recommend knowing, I think the power struggle is one of the best points that you can really focus on. I feel like it comes up in a lot of papers, and it just, even if you're not writing about the power struggle, if you're talking about the transformation, if you're talking about ideology, like it's just one of those points that pervades all of the kind of syllabus. So I think it's really important understanding it. We've got this quote: the leadership conflict was a radical struggle between permanent revolution and socialism in one country. And that's why I think having that, those first slides that we looked at on Trotsky's permanent revolution idea and then socialism in one country, I think understanding the difference, that's generally the basis of the power struggle. So understanding that is really, really important. Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution had been the dominant ideological platform of the Bolshevik Party since 1917, but support was waning. After World War I and the Civil War, the Russian populace desired peace and stability, and he was still very much on that, while permanent revolution had this emphasis on international revolution, which is just going to require more conflict. Everyone's tired of it after World War I and the Civil War. They just want peace. They just want to be secure. They just want to like chill out. And Trotsky's out here like, no, let's go. You know what? Let's not even stop here. Let's go conflict international. Let's take it worldwide. Let's literally take it worldwide. So a lot of the people aren't going to support that. And an international revolution also seemed very unlikely when capitalism appeared to be thriving. A Soviet-style revolution in the UK or even the US was a pipe dream. So at the time, like, it didn't even make sense when they were, especially with the NEP, and they're using capitalism, and capitalism is genuinely restoring prosperity in their country. How is he going to go and he's going to be like, you know what, let's bring communism worldwide. Let's take it worldwide. Like, that doesn't even add up if they're not even doing it in their own country yet. So that was how, like, the Russian population wasn't really the biggest fan of Trotsky. And like I said, he was always on the road, he was always on the battlefield, very much to do with the war and his commissar position. So it wasn't happening in that sense. While Stalin's socialism in one country, where communist efforts are concentrated in the Soviet Union, were more pragmatic, and they instilled nationalism, because you can also see it as a direct response to the failings of Trotsky. He was very politically cunning. Like, man knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing. He finessed the system so hard, like in the power struggle. But he was very much able to increase his support because he aligned his ideology with Lenin. Even though Lenin literally supported the permanent revolution, he died. So He was much more focusing on like what Lenin was promoting in public. And Stalin exaggerated the differences in ideology between Lenin and Trotsky by bringing up old disagreements, which were pre-1917, along with Trotsky's brief Menshevik past. So he was capitalizing off them and their disagreements to make himself look better. And that's why he was quite the cunning guy. It was considered a revolution from above, because it was bureaucratic. I'm forgetting how to speak English. It's nearly 2 hours, guys. Where the small group of state officials, which was from the Politburo, made most of the important decisions. Rather than the masses agitating for revolution and social change, Stalin made those decisions for them. So that the idea of collectivization, and then through that, the cult of personality started, and he was able to like abuse and develop that. So the Soviet state under Stalin was very much under that. Collectivization, industrialization are such key, like every point in the syllabus is important, but I feel like power struggle, economic transformation, and political and social transformation are really, really big ones, because that's the big picture. That was just a reversal of the new economic policy, honestly, where they had the production targets. I wanted to add in some quotes for you. But by 1937, pretty much everyone was an employee of the state. He achieved his goals. Guys, that brings us